I'm Ashutosh Varshney, and the Center Director of Success Center, and Professor in Political Science. Let me actually start with something that Ramchandra Guha has written as the series editor, the series in which Chitralekha's book appeared. And I'll tell you why I'm starting this way in a moment. I have long believed that every historian must, at some stage of her career, try her hand at writing a biography. I have long believed that every historian must, at some stage of her career, try her hand at writing a biography. It provides a different and in some respects more exciting challenges than crafting works of social or political history. I'm not a historian. There are historians sitting in this room, and a historian is actually presenting her work today. But I have always believed this, and and in my profession, political science, the art of writing biographies has disappeared. It actually will be a professional suicide today to write a biography, unless you become a very senior, and you can be as iconoclastic as Paul Brass, who wrote a biography of Chaudhry Charan Singh, and a 2-volume biography of Chaudhry Charan Singh, and Lloyd and Suzanne Rudolph wrote a biography of a famous Rajasthani prince. The name escapes me. And they did that. Brass did that when he was 70 years old. And Lloyd and Suzanne wrote that biography also around that time. But and it was not so uncommon in an earlier period. Michael Brescia, when he wrote his biography of Nehru, was an assistant professor at McGill. So we are very thankful to those who outside psychology, such people like Ashish Nandi, who are very fond of writing biographies, outside psychology, let's say history, who provide us these portraits, which say something more than the evolution of or clash between abstract forces of classes and religious groups and the motives, various other motives of history. Right, it says something, it gives us a certain insight which you would lack otherwise. So, the Chitralekha Zutshi is a class of 1962 professor of history at College of William and Mary. And her earlier works were social and political histories, I think, right? Languages of Belonging, Islam, Regional Identity and the Making of Kashmir, published in 2004. Kashmir's Contested Past, Narrative, Sacred Geographies and Historical Imagination, Oxford 2014. Kashmir, History, Politics and Representation, an edited volume with Cambridge in 2018, where I think Dean has a piece in that. When I introduce you, I'll introduce that piece. And Kashmir, Oxford, India, Short Introduction in 2019, and finally now Sheikh Abdullah, The Caged Lion of Kashmir, in 2024, published earlier this year by HarperCollins in India, and Yale is putting it out next month, in about a month actually. In 4 weeks the book will be out from Yale. Of course, she is almost incomparably situated for this work, having spent so much of her career working on Kashmir. So let's hear from a leading scholar of Kashmir, her understanding of one of the most important political leaders to have emerged in the 20th century, and we have other scholars of Kashmir here who will comment on that. But I am absolutely fascinated. I only wrote one paper on Kashmir. So, welcome Chitralekha. You have 45-50 minutes to enlighten us about the lion, caged lion of Kashmir, Sheikh Abdullah.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Thank you for that generous introduction, for inviting me to this book at the Pavan and Natalia putting up in my keep emails and requests and so on. So I'm really happy to be here. I think I was in Providence
20 years ago.
Oh, even more than that maybe. I mean, yesterday I gave a talk at Tufts, which is my alma mater, and it's been 24 years since I got my PhD. It was an out-of-body experience.
But you didn't cry, as I cried while writing.
No.
Okay.
No, it's only my kids can make me cry.
Okay.
And tear my hair up. Even writing this book didn't make me cry, which is saying something. But just something very quickly about the book, because you received the flyer which Yale University Press Marketing very kindly made for my book talk, since the book is not yet out, and if you would like to purchase the book, there's a discount code on this. But what you'll also notice is that this edition, which comes out on May 28th, there's also an audio book, by the way, so I'm very excited. It's my first audio book. Yale is putting it out as an audio book as well.
Also, we'll buy several copies. We do for our book because we couldn't buy. Otherwise, we buy many copies, and then we.
So you notice that the cover is different, from the poster, and so there's the book is exactly the same. Otherwise, besides the book cover and the series editors forward, which you just heard from, because the Harper edition was published in the Indian Live series, which is edited by Ramchandra Guha. The first book in the Indian Live series was Ashoka by Patrick O'Legal, and mine is the second book in that series. The third book just recently came out, Nico Slate's Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. There are many other books, but they're not going to be out for a few years yet. There's still room for you to write a biography, by the way, since you're an established scholar and an iconoclast. The covers, HarperCollins has its own cover that they sourced from Getty. This cover that it was given by me, this photograph I found in the Press Information Bureau of India, and came like that, so they use that photograph. So the covers are different, the book is exactly the same. Now, since Ashutosh already brought this up, and this is the way I start all these book talks. Why biography, and why a biography of Sheikh Abdullah? I am a historian. I'm trained as a historian. All of my books up to this point had been, basically, histories of intellectual histories or histories of political culture of Kashmir and how it fits in with India and Indian nationalism and so on. But Sheikh Abdullah's kind of haunted, my work has loomed large. I mean, Sheikh Abdullah kind of casts a very long shadow in Kashmir, whether you like him or you hate him. And there are plenty of those kinds of opinions about him. But as a historian of Kashmir, it's very hard to escape him. I mean, there's, when I first started work, and this is going to date me now, on my dissertation, the first time I visited Kashmir was in 1996, as a historian or as a scholar, a wannabe scholar. And I remember going, it was the height of the insurgency. It was terrible, terrible time to be in Kashmir. Not that there has ever been a better time, but it was literally, for your own safety, it was really bad. And I remember going to, this was just for a reconnaissance trip, I remember going to the library or the archive, in library in the archive. And everywhere I went, they told me, Madam, आप कश्मीर की हिस्ट्री के बारे में लिखना चाहती हैं, you need 3 books. Then you can go back. आप अमेरिका वापस जाएं और वहाँ फिर लिख सकती हैं 3 किताबें. So the first is Kalhan's Rajtarangini, which is a 12th century history of Kashmir. Right? The second is, now we jumped several centuries, Walter Lawrence's Valley of Kashmir. This is, Walter Lawrence was of course a colonial official, carried out land reforms in Kashmir. Not land reform, I'm sorry, land settlement. I'm confusing land reform. Was published in the 1890s, and then Atish-e-Chinar, Ek Aap Beeti, which is the autobiography of Sheikh. So these are the 3 books that you need to read, and you're all set. And of course, I did read those particular books, but then I fortunately had the good sense to discover other materials and so on, and I wrote my first book, Languages of Belonging, which was about sort of the interactions between regional, religious, national identities in Kashmir from the late 18th to the mid 20th centuries or so. But it's really in my second book, Kashmir's Contested Past, that I was really confronted with Sheikh Abdullah. Right? So Sheikh Abdullah, of course, very important in my first book as well. The 30s and 40s in Kashmir, you can't really talk about without thinking of him. But the reason that I say that he's more important in the second book is because my second book is really about how the idea of history itself and how Kashmiris sort of envision their past and basically directly challenging this idea that the Rajtarangini is the only history in the Indian subcontinent, and certainly in Kashmir, because there's a long prehistory and a long post-history from Rajtarangini. But again, Sheikh Abdullah kept coming up in my conversations with people, and Atish-e-Chinar, in fact, is claimed by Sheikh Abdullah himself, in the foreword, as being a continuation of Kalhan's Rajtarangini, right? So he says that, my life story, he kind of makes the story of his life into the history of Kashmir, basically. He says it's synonymous, I am Kashmir, I am the history of Kashmir, right? Kashmir past. So that, and that, so when I was talking to people and reading, Atish and all these other texts, I read multiple texts in various languages. And one of the things that kept coming up with my conversations with Sheikh Abdullah was that, I saw these generational differences in the way that he was kind of talked about and memorialized or commemorated and so on. So the older generation in their 70s and 80s kind of talked about him as a saint and someone who had led Kashmir out of Kashmir and Kashmiris out of this united state and freed them from oppression and October oppression and so on. And then the next generation after that was just deeply troubled by Sheikh Abdullah and felt that he was basically a traitor. I mean, and somebody who had sold their dreams and their future self-determination by making this accord with India in 1975. Right? So there was that, and these people spend their time basically tearing him down. They write op-eds and do all sorts of things to just tear down the legacy of not just Sheikh Abdullah but his national conference and such. And then the younger generation that in universities and so on. Now this was a while back that I was talking to them, but they were kind of knew who Sheikh Abdullah was, but didn't really feel invested in sort of understanding him very much, because they had kind of grown up with this, their parent generation basically telling him that he was, some kind of traitor. So they thought of him in terms of 1947 when he, so many of them said, he signed the document of accession to India, which of course was not the case, but it was the Maharaja, but it was with his assent that this happened. So they link him to that moment of Kashmir being linked to India, which they see as the beginning of Kashmir's, sort of enslavement to India and so on. And then they of course also remember him for the land reform. So they've heard of the land reform and they know that he did do this. This was something very good that Sheikh Abdullah did. And then the third thing is of course 1975 he signed this accord, which kind of basically ended, foreclosed any possibility of Kashmir ever getting any hope of getting its Kashmir getting a political right. So this generational difference in the way that he's remembered was something that really I felt needed a biographical account of him. What I also found was that although people had all of these opinions about him, that not very much had been written about him really. I mean, there's a few scattered Urdu biographies that came out. So, for instance, in the 1960s in Pakistan, and that was for a particular political purpose. Some scattered ones in the 1970s and 80s out of Kashmir as well, but none that kind of really dealt with his entire life, and a couple in English, of course, as well, but none that kind of dealt with his entire life from a historical perspective, right? So I wanted to be a historian who was writing a biography, right? And so what I realized when I started sort of working on his life, I thought I knew a lot about his life already because I was a historian of Kashmir and I worked on documents and so on. But what I realized was that I actually didn't quite understand, why he had made the kinds of political choices he had made, or what was driving him. And I also realized that working on his life actually allowed me to understand Kashmir, of course, but more importantly, sort of the coming into its own of India as a modern state, right, as a post-colonial state. Because many of the sort of ideas that defined India in the early post-colonial period and then later on as well was something that it kind of worked out through its engagement with Kashmir. Whether it worked out well or not, that's of course a different story. But Kashmir through the embodiment of Sheikh Abdullah was really the place where all of the anxieties about Indian sort of nationhood played out. Right? Not only did they play out in his life, but he was both for India. Right? So he was the problem and also the solution. Right? Because they could not see anyone else. I mean, so first he was, as you know, in 1953 he was arrested and he was deposed and then arrested. And then, whenever the center and the other players around, who wanted a solution to Kashmir, thought about how this was going to happen, they honed in on Sheikh Abdullah. Sheikh Abdullah was, as I said, the problem and the solution. So build him up, tear him down, build him up, tear him down. That was his, that was the kind of relationship that worked out. But anyway, so what I realized was, I learned as a historian, right? So we generally kind of, at least until recently, now this has changed in the past decade and a half, tend to stop in 1947, right? I mean, historians of South Asia, like, our work is done, let's leave it to the much more learned political scientists, right, to take over. And they've done such a fabulous job. So, so what I realized working on his life, because he kind of sort of straddles that divide so well, right? I mean, he transitions from, whether well or not, that's a different story, but transitions from this kind of late anti-colonial politician to sort of, early post-colonial Indian politician, right? And really kind of embodies some of those characteristics of, early post-colonial Indian politicians. He's not unique at all in that way. Right? So he straddles that divide and allowed me at least to understand India. I truly understood India for the first time, not just as a scholar, just as a person, as an Indian, by writing this biography. So this was, so it was a truly sort of learning experience for me. Of course, it was one of the most difficult projects I've undertaken. For a variety of reasons. I mean, again, I don't think like a biographer. I think like a historian. And you could argue if you read the book that sometimes it reads like a history and not a biography. I don't know. But nonetheless, I had to keep training myself to think from his perspective, right? Which is really, difficult to do. But it made me kind of understand his political choices and his political compulsion. Didn't necessarily make me agree with him or like him necessarily or whatever, but at least understand where he was coming from. So that was one of the reasons. The other thing, of course, was that I, wanted to write it in a more accessible manner. And I don't know if you guys agree, but it's, hopefully it's not written in kind of jargony academic language. It's something that can be read by people. And I've been told in India, at least, that by not academics, that they enjoyed the experience of reading it, and not so that's the other. But the biggest obstacle, of course, was sources, right? So writing anything to do with the history of Kashmir is just, I'm sure you're discovering this and know this. It is so difficult to get, to just so access to sources, availability of sources is so difficult. You both know this. But with him, with this kind of work was doubly difficult because Sheikh Abdullah hasn't really written very much, right? So for a biographer, it's a boon if the subject has a lot of has done a lot of writing. Although it can also be a curse because then you're kind of just immersed in it and you can never get out of this person's perspective. But for Sheikh Abdullah, I mean, other than Atish-e-Chinar, which itself is a very interesting text, but not really his writing, because it was narrated to his amanuenses and then published posthumously in 1986. So sources were there wasn't very much writing by him. So what that actually made me do is think about this project as the biography of not just this individual but of a generation, right? Of people, especially in the early period. It's sort of what happens to this generation of Indian political leader. With him, of course, as a representative of a sort of South Asian politician in the 20th century, global 20th century, right? Because one of the things I was able to do was, other than understanding the becoming of India itself and so on, understand sort of these global currents of communism and socialism and secularism and, colonial nationalism and so on through his life, using his life as a prism. So I wrote, so then there are these, all these other people, around him that come to life, hopefully in this biography as well. But also people who didn't necessarily know him. So his interlocutors, the press, right? The press becomes became a very important source for me. Whether it's the Indian press, the Pakistani press, the Punjabi press in late colonial India, all of these, and how he engaged with the press, because Sheikh Abdullah was very much aware of his own image and the way that he wanted to present it and present himself and so on. After all, that's why Atish was narrated by him towards the end of his life, was trying to rehabilitate his image after signing the accord. So, this kind of engagement with these critics and interlocutors or friends or and so on. So that is something that that's something that I sort of helped me write the biography as well. The other there was another kind of issue that I faced while writing this biography. So Sheikh Abdullah spent 16 years, 6 months, and 22 days in prison of one kind or another, whether it was exile, house arrest, actual prison, and so on. That's a very long time to be sort of outside the political arena, right, for a political figure. So how does one move the narrative forward when you are out of the sort of political mainstream for a biographer? I mean, and so that was something I thought when I was sort of when I was researching it. So how am I going to write these chapters when he's not around? And then, of course, the way I kind of stitch them together is oral histories and oral narratives were very important. So the way that he was remembered and kept alive in the memories of people in the 1960s and 70s, which, by the way, he was very much, again, he was very aware of the fact that he would be forgotten. So he would write letters from prison to the members of the plebiscite front and to telling them how to read these aloud to my supporters all over in shrines and so on in Kashmir. So those letters became really important in the way that he. But then there was also this kind of entire network of people who was working kind of behind the scenes to keep Abdullah's memory alive, right, and also to get him out of prison, right. So people like Mridula Sarabhai or Maulana Masoodi, even Jayaprakash Narayan. I mean, these people were really very active behind the scenes in again making sure that Abdullah was not forgotten, not out. So those people's correspondences and their their lives, their political work and so on was very important. I spent, months and months in the Nehru Memorial because it has all of the, private papers of people like Jayaprakash Narayan and T.M. Colin, all of these people who, of course, wealth of information, not just on Kashmir and Sheikh Abdullah, just in general. The other, of course, set of papers that I was able to access was the post-1947 Nehru papers, which, when I started work on this in 2014, were closed to scholars. And I wrote to Sonia Gandhi several times and with no response. And then I filed a right to information request for those papers. And miraculously, it worked. I got a registered letter at my Williamsburg address. I was like, why is the mailman knocking on my door? Like, what do you want? He gives me this letter from the Cultural Ministry or something saying that we have received your request. Is this a prank? Somebody playing on me? And then 2 weeks later, I get an email saying, please come and look at these papers. So anyway, those are just a treasure of those of you who are, of course, interested in post-1947 India, because they have all the correspondence that Nehru wrote and received. At least at the time that I was looking at them, this would be 2016-17, they were not indexed, so I had to literally go through everything, which in some ways was useful because I saw his correspondences related to Kashmir in the context of the other stuff that he was kind of involved in and how he was thinking about his relations with America or Russia and so on, and then he was writing something to Sheikh Abdullah, Bakshi, and exchanging. So it was, that was a really important source of information, and then oral narrative, as I said. So these, sources, again, as I said, were a challenge. They took me everywhere. I managed to also go to Pakistan to research in Lahore and met sort of the other side of the Kashmiri diaspora, right? Who at various points of time moved and have this very visceral. The Kashmiris in Pakistan have not forgotten Sheikh Abdullah. Sheikh Abdullah is important. Like sometimes in India, I'll be like, "Hey, Sheikh Saab ke baare mein kyun baat karne waapis?" There, they're like, "Yeah, we want to talk about Sheikh Abdullah." So there was this real sense because some of them sort of left before he kind of sold out and so on to the Kashmir. This side, I feel like I'm sitting in Sri Lanka. But this side, meaning India, the Indian side. I forgot I was in Rhode Island. So to them, there's, he's still this kind of harbinger of freedom and such. There was a few families that I met who were very, very bitter against him because they were forced to leave. Baramulla or Srinagar, whatever, in 1950, because when he was in power, his regime was so repressive, against people who expressed any kind of opposition to him. Any kind. Didn't even have to be overtly pro-Pakistan. It was just. But by and large, I found that they still kind of revered him in Pakistan. Right? I. Collected sort of oral narratives across, many different, classes, groups, and so on, including, by the way, Karan Singh, who told me, that we used to call Sheikh Saab Frankenstein, right? Which I found in the early 1950s, right before he was deposed and arrested, which I found kind of apropos because, having created sort of this monster of Kashmiri nationalism, he had paid the ultimate political price by being, removed and such. But it was interesting. That also gave me kind of an insight, and reading Karan Singh's other sort of letters to Indira Gandhi and so on. He was consistently against Sheikh Abdullah's release throughout. Throughout the time he was in the sort of in prison and exile, and convinced Indira Gandhi several times not to have him released. Until, of course, he signed the accord and such. So those are, that's a few sort of notes or comments on the sources. And then the book is divided into 8 chapters, and chapter 4 is sort of the hinge because it's the sort of moment of 1952-53 when things kind of turned in a certain way and really led Sheikh Abdullah to kind of reimagine, reinstate himself as this revolutionary and so on. But there are a couple of themes that kind of run through the book, and I talk about that in the introduction. One is prisons. So by prison I mean, of course, the fact that he was in prison for a long time actually, but also metaphorically in prison, in the sense that he had this kind of vision of the Kashmiri nation that was very narrow in some ways, and he could never quite. I mean, he was always sort of imagined himself as the leader of Kashmir, right? And you would kind of that was sometimes he was talking about the princely state, but he was really talking about the valley, right? So he was a leader of Kashmiri Muslims. He was a Kashmiri Muslim himself, and that's how he thought of himself even after independence and when 2/3 of the state were in India, and had the possibility at some point in his life of kind of becoming a leader of India's Muslims, but always kind of pushed that away and really stayed within that kind of narrow vision of Kashmir. So Kashmir was sort of his prison in a metaphorical sense. That's what I'm trying to say. I mean, his vision for the Kashmiri nation was very narrow. So that is prison, and then of course sacred spaces. The shrines and religious spaces of the Kashmir Valley. In particular.
Can you say a bit more about how he viewed Jammu? Or Ladakh, but Jammu mostly.
How he viewed, well, it depends on what time period you're talking about, right? So in the 1930s, he, at least in the early 1930s, he was of the same mind with the, leadership of the Jammu Muslims. They were all part of, like Chaudhry Ghulam Abbas, for instance, or Allah Khasaka. They were all part of the same Muslim
conference.
And then by the late 1930s, you already have this kind of divide emerging where Sheikh Abdullah kind of takes his movement into a different direction than what the Jammu Muslims want, right? And so they resurrect the Muslim conference. So already at that moment, already in the this is already in the mid 1930s, this kind of divide sort of starts to happen, and then after independence, of course, Jammu becomes a big thorn in his side because especially once he does the land reforms, Jammu rises up in revolt against his regime, right? And the Praja Parishad agitation. So what he then calls the Jammu basically is kind of communal space, right? For him, he says they're all communal, they're communalists. They're agitating on a communal basis. They don't like me because I'm Muslim, and so he played that communal card with them. Ladakh he completely ignored.
Yeah, and he could afford to because it was so small. Yeah.
And it's those two places really that, I mean, he could never really bring them under the ambit of this vision that he had of Kashmiri nationalism, right? So,
did he ever acknowledge, sorry for one more interruption here on this question, did he ever acknowledge that the valley, while certainly bigger than any other portion of Jammu and Kashmir, is only slightly bigger than Jammu. Jammu was 46%, 47% for a long time, right? And the valley was 52, 53. Is there any concession anywhere that democratically speaking, in terms of votes and etc., there's a whole notion of symbolism. Let's say Kashmir is most purely represented by the valley. Let's accept that for a moment, right? But the second point would be, there is a place in my state which is 46, 47% of my state, right? So I have to, as a democratic leader, deal with nearly half of my state. And is there any recognition ever that this is all nearly half of my state?
It's the democratic leader part
that is the issue here. No.
Because he was not actually running for any election, right? I mean, he was put in place as the Prime Minister in this first regime. it's really in 1977 is the
77 is the first
time.
election.
And that's when he actually does cross lines and goes appeals to the Jammu Muslims, all of whom vote for the National Conference, right? And there is where you can see this kind of Jammu, Kashmir, religious kind of divide emerging, in the sense that only the Muslims of Jammu vote for the National Conference and so on. So you can clearly see that pattern that then emerges in the for subsequent elections.
And the Muslims of Jammu were just about a third of Jammu, right? And two-thirds were Hindu. And that space is, that separation, that communalization of political space is very clear by 77. Thank you.
But also, I mean, before 1947, Jammu's Muslims have a very different sort of interests. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so they, their interests are with the politics of the Punjab, they're linked to the politics of the Punjab, and they're really about they're a different class of people, as in socio-economic class. Right? They are sort of well-to-do elites, and they want to be part of the government service, right? And what Sheikh Abdullah is doing or what he's championing is basically he's saying that this is not just about government service for Muslims, it should be about the interests of all classes of Muslims, right? And those people really are not, of concern to the Jammu Muslims at all, So there's this kind of class basis, even within the valley there's a class basis to the divide that he creates between the religious leadership and the National Conference, right? What made Sheikh Abdullah such a powerful, charismatic leader was the fact that he was able to kind of, speak in a religious idiom, like many leaders of that time period. He's not the only one, right? I mean, a lot of people, including, you can talk about Gandhi, for instance, speak the language of political, economic, social rights in a religious idiom, right? So he's doing it in the Muslim idiom. This does not foreclose for them the possibility of pluralism, right? Religious pluralism. So if you want to define secularism in terms of religion, because that's what when he says secularism, when Sheikh Abdullah said secularism, what he was really talking about was religious pluralism, right? So what he said that, Kashmir is a plural society, there are all these different groups and they all have the same sort of economic and political issues, and so we should join hands, unite to be able to sort of, get ahead with these issues, with this massively repressive authoritarian government, that the only way we can achieve that is by doing that, rather than simply trying to get ourselves in government service, which is what the Jammu Hindus were concerned with. And in this, he found sort of common cause with the Congress, right? I mean, with the Congress, with the socialists in the Congress, with the Communist Party, right? That Communist Party of India, which was very, very active in Kashmir by the late 1930s already, and certainly through the 40s. What I was talking about. Okay, so, religious idiom, that's why I started talking about this. So, again, the fact that he presented himself as this kind of, a leader that could bridge the divide between, the old guard religious leadership and the new wave of, these socially, politically activist leaders is what made him kind of, a significant leader. Now, before I stop talking, so what is my assessment of Sheikh Abdullah? This is the.
Can I ask you one more question? Can you give us in 5 minutes the land reform spirit of Sheikh Abdullah's life? What was the original? Because again and again the argument that I kept hearing was that he was communist. Look at the way he was.
You were hearing from whom?
Well, lots of people, but some people would say that an idiom was religious, but that couldn't be true. I mean, a political scientist wouldn't ever easily accept something like that. But what was the land reforms It was seen in the land reforms literature, which I studied as a political economist at one point. The land reforms in Kashmir were seen as among the most extensive before Kerala burst on the scene in West Bengal. They were more extensive than the land reforms in the Chaudhry Charan Singh UP. So if you can tell us a bit more about the land reforms in Kashmir. Yeah.
So the genesis of the land reforms, of course, lies in the Naya Kashmir Manifesto, right, which was put forward by the National Conference in 1944. It's an exact replica of the Soviet Constitution, basically. So I mean, it was, and it talked about some of these radical, economic and political changes that if National Conference came to power, they would put in place, right? So, and it became sort of a rhetorical device because the National Conference had no power in 1944. So it was a powerful rhetorical device at that moment when, again, the National Conference's popularity was at an ebb in Kashmir in 1944 to present this thing to the people, to bring them in, and the communists were behind it, of course, to bring them really in touch with these people who were really suffering, of course, in 1944. Right? I mean, it's the war and the Muslim Conference is doing actually quite well. And so once, so this was on his agenda. So once he comes to power, right, his government, as I said, is one of the most repressive, right? So he's, completely kills off any possibility of an opposition in Kashmir, any kind of opposition, right? Including, by the way, the communists, right? So he undercuts the basis of his own legitimacy and connection to the people, right? By just getting rid of, either appropriating them, paying them off, or expelling them, all sorts of things. Right? So all of these unions and workers' parties and all that was really vibrant in Kashmir in the 1930s and 40s, gone. Then the other context for the institution of the land reform in 1951 is that so people are really, the Kashmiris are very unhappy with him, and his government. And then he goes, and then of course there's the larger context of the dispute over Kashmir between India and Pakistan. So he goes off to, he makes success in the Security Council meetings and so on, and there he sees that India is also on a back foot. Zafarullah Khan is making these, really kind of very convincing arguments to the UN, and they're completely convinced the Anglo-American bloc about Pakistan's claim on Kashmir. And he comes back and thinks, have I backed the wrong horse, right? I mean, how do I, sort of get back and that, there are two ways in which I think that he sort of tries to reassert his leadership in Kashmir, but also in a global stage to show that I'm, the legitimate leader of Kashmir. One is by carrying out these land reforms, and the second is by
who had most of the land, and who were the most biggest beneficiaries of the land. Because if Jammu Muslims were a lot of landlords were Jammu Muslims, in Jammu at least. In the valley, it's the Kashmiri Pandits who are mostly landlords or not. Is there? Can you say something about this social makeup of the landlord class and the peasant class?
A number of landlords were. Afzal Beg, for instance, his deputy was huge.
Huge landlord in the valley.
And he is the architect of these land reforms. But in Jammu, by and large, the people who lost out were the Hindu landlords.
Hindu landlords in Jammu.
And so, they started this Praja Parishad agitation on that, they're taking away. And of course, the big thing about it was no compensation, right? So the land reforms, basically, the way they were written was, confiscation of land with no compensation at all, right? Which was the biggest sort of issue, right?
And what was the social makeup of landlords in the valley?
Landlords in the valley were,
both Pandits and Muslims.
And so once even as you're talking about the land reforms, there's a flood of sort of, resistance to it from the Hindus of Jammu. The Jan Sangh, of course, gets involved and they organize this movement, the Praja Parishad agitation again. against him, and make it sound as though they've been basically, dispossessed, right? But
it was a fairly successful land reform despite the opposition.
right, but if you read the it was, so on paper it was, but the implementation of it was really quite shoddy, right? And this is where people like Afzal Beg and so on, their families continued to retain, huge tracts of land when they, the poor, marshy, tracts of land were given to peasants and were sort of taken. People declared their land orchards because orchards were not considered part of the land. So there are all sorts of ways in which this was, not actually implemented the way it should have been, which led to even further anger, right, amongst the people who should have been the beneficiaries of it, right, because they saw that it was not really kind of working out, for them. So the other thing was the Constituent Assembly. So the Constituent Assembly was, he said this is going to be the body that writes Kashmir's constitution and so on, and then we'll outline our relationship with India and the elections were it again did not allow anyone else to run other than on a national conference ticket. So there were 75 seats and they were all unopposed. Right, the Praja Parishad refused to run. They boycotted the elections. So because there was so much pressure on them
And the Congress Party?
And Nehru, the Congress, Nehru was very clear about, Congress should not get involved in this, right? National conference is going to get us India in any kind of future sort of, plebiscite and so on. And Nehru, there are some very damning things being said about, can be said about Nehru in all of this, because there are lots of people who are telling him, what he's doing, what Sheikh Abdullah is doing, not in terms of, this thing about, he's talking about, Kashmir should be independent, not that, but what he's doing in terms of repressing, and completely silencing opposition and the press in Kashmir. People are hungry. There's corruption. I mean, the corruption was just legion, during this period. So, the national conference basically it was a one-party state, right? So the national conference basically became, the state. The party was the state was the party. And Nehru said, yes, we understand he's a gunda, he's corrupt, but democracy is not everything. We have invested so much in making sure Kashmir is a part of India, and we have to just support him because he's the only one who can deliver to us. And this is what Sheikh Abdullah constantly also said, right? If you don't support me in the land reforms, I will not be able to deliver India to you. If you don't support me, that's really, I will not deliver. And Sardar Patel, of course, while he was alive, had this relationship because he said, this one just is using us, like, and so that, so those are something in the sort of, broader context for some of these things. But Sheikh Abdullah himself, my assessment of him, he was, he clearly, as I said, at the beginning, a very 20th century sort of late colonial, early post-colonial leader. Like all Muslim leaders, as I said, we are not all Muslim leaders, many leaders, drew on a religious idiom to talk about, rights, with a dash of sort of socialism thrown in, clearly very much in favor of religious pluralism, or at least envisioned sort of, the Kashmiri nation in those plural terms, and hence was very close to kind of, at least ideologically, with Gandhi's vision of, for India, say, for instance. He synonymous, in parallel sort of envisioned Kashmir in that way. And then, and really hoped, this is now it's still in colonial India, really hoped that Kashmir could be an autonomous unit within a federal India, right? That was his sort of vision for Kashmir, and he actually felt that that's where Kashmir could, be achieve its full potential and so on. And of course, the partition and creation of Pakistan put paid to those dreams, and then he had to sort of make a choice, and then events such as Poonch, Gilgit going their own way, and then the invasion, and all of that happened in October of 1947. Basically, he had no choice but to accept India's or Kashmir's accession to India to stop this. And after that, of course, he became sort of an agent of repression himself, right? So this leader who had led Kashmiris out of, this Togra repression became basically,
repressive ruler himself.
Yes. But yeah, there's a lot more to say, but maybe I'll stop there. Let the discussants.
So thank you. I'll have some. I mean, I've already asked a couple of questions, so I'll keep quiet now. Let's start with Dean Accardi, who is a historian of Kashmir and currently an assistant professor of history at Connecticut College. And one of his essays, Embedded Mystics, writing Lal Dead, if I can pronounce it, Nandrishi, I knew quite well, into the Kashmiri landscape, in Kashmir History and Representation, edited, and Politics, edited by Chitralekha Zutshi. Orientalism and Invention of Kashmiri Religions, in International Journal of Hindu Studies. And a very intriguing title, which I'm going to have to read very soon, Making a Hindu Saint in Kashmir. This must be about Lal Dev. Yes? Yeah. International Journal of Hindu Studies again. So welcome, Dean. 10 to 15 minutes for a commentary.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming today. And thank you Ashu and the Saxena Center for inviting us here. And thank you Chitralekha for this thought-provoking book and presentation. As you mentioned, I'm Dean Accardi. I was thinking maybe the best way, I prepared notes so that I don't go on forever. That I thought maybe one of the best ways to respond to the book and your presentation is from my own areas of expertise and interest, hopefully to draw out the implications of your work for those with overlapping investments. So for those who are not aware, my own research focuses on the politics of religion and state in early modern Kashmir, particularly the period of the Kashmiri Sultanate, which reigned from 1320 to 1586 CE. A period whose figures are regularly invoked in Kashmir today due to its being considered the last time Kashmiris ruled themselves, before being conquered by subsequent empires from the Mughals to the Dogras, and for some would even say India and Pakistan today. So, and in fact, Sheikh Abdullah himself invoked these figures from the time period from the Kashmiri Sultanate quite frequently, including in his autobiography, Sheikh. So in my work, and then you'll see how this translates into my question. In my work, I examine histories and hagiographies, or writings about saints, and what they imply about the socio-political circumstances of the time, and how those writings either reflect or intervene in those circumstances. Furthermore, I am particularly invested in Hindu-Muslim interactions in Kashmir, both contentious and in solidarity, and how and why social formations at particular moments bring those religious communities together or drive them apart. Finally, and closely related, I'm deeply interested in the notion of Kashmiriya, an idea of there existing a unique Kashmiri heritage of communal harmony that brings together or even transcends Hindu-Muslim communal divides. As you point out in your book, Sheikh Abdullah heavily promoted Kashmiriya throughout most of his political career, and may be the kind of main source for this idea's circulation in Kashmiri discourse in the 20th century and today. So my questions for you today are along these three avenues. First, this book, Sheikh Abdullah, The Caged Lion of Kashmir, is part, as you mentioned, is part of a series titled Indian Lives, and from my understanding, what you affirmed, is the second in the series after Patrick Olivel's Ashoka, Portrait of a Philosopher King. So I find the title of this series quite fascinating, and I'm sure many people will find it problematic, that like Ashoka is being defined as an Indian life, when he lived several millennia before the modern nation state of India existed. Right? So it seems similar to kind of framing a biography of a leader of a Native American mound builder civilization as an American life. So like how is that work? So what work, and this is a question, what work does it do to frame such a figure in those terms? I can imagine many people are wondering the same thing about your book. Why depict Sheikh Abdullah's life as an Indian life? Something that doesn't seem merely accidental, but something you actually, as you talked about in your presentation, kind of lean into to talk about how representative he is of a kind of post-colonial Indian politician. So, but however, I'm perhaps more interested in hearing about what you understand this book, how you understand this book. Like, what is its genre? What is it meant to do? As someone who works on hagiography, there's a lot of discomfort and attention paid in the field to distinguish between hagiography and academic history due to the distinct differences in investments and dispositions of the author towards the figures being written about. When it comes to biography versus history, though, the distinction becomes less clear. There's a kind of fuzziness there. So I find it interesting then in your introduction that you refer to this book in terms of life history. And as you likely know, in the fields of history and hagiographical studies, the more technical nomenclature for writing about saints is not hagiography, but is in fact lives of the saint, because the term life is more close to the original terms used in European Christian writings on saints. So to talk about lives is to talk about kind of veneratory texts about a particular saint. So what is the relationship between these two terms being put together, life and history, when you say life history? Which seems to imply some sort of mixture of kind of venerative writing and historical critical approaches to figures of the past. Okay, so along those lines, in your book, Sheikh Abdullah seems to be a kind of individual writ large, whose life story as an individual is rendered both symbolic of and in interaction with the larger social world in which he existed and the flow of history in which he participated. In some ways, this is resonant with, yet the opposite of certain kinds of social history, in which prominent individuals and leaders are read as instances of larger social dynamics and forces that are in fact the drivers of history and change over time. So it seems like sometimes in your book it reads like a critical history and historical analysis of Sheikh Abdullah, while at others it seems like a kind of memorialization of a figure that should be remembered as a kind of great figure. So how do you see this book and your work on Sheikh Abdullah in relation to these kind of different aims and intentions? Second, as I mentioned, I'm deeply invested in the study of Hindu-Muslim interactions. And in the early chapters of your book, you mentioned how Dogra state policies of importing non-Kashmiri Hindus to run top positions in the state, as well as Sheikh Abdullah addressing the systemic institutional marginalization of Kashmiri Muslims from positions of power under the Dogra court. Yet, you do not explicitly address what Ridurai extensively goes on about in Hindu rulers, Muslim subjects, namely how intentionally religious-based policies of the Dogra state seemed intended to favor Kashmiri Pundits over Kashmiri Muslims, such that Kashmiri Pundits may have been rendered a kind of petit bourgeois over a Kashmiri Muslim peasantry under Dogra rule. Of course, this is a massive generalization, with plenty of examples of wealthy and powerful Muslims, as well as poor pundits of the time, but it seems like there might be some missed opportunity to not engage more extensively in how maybe Dogra social engineering may have impacted later religiously inflected politics of the valley. For example, a number of the key figures featured at the end of your chapter 1 that form a kind of cohort of Kashmiri activists in the early 20th century, that apart from Abdullah himself, many of the figures appear to be either privileged Muslims or poor pundits. From my reading of this time period, these figures are somewhat unrepresentative of the larger demographics of Kashmir at the time. It is therefore interesting to think why these elite and privileged Kashmiri Muslims circled within the same circles as poor Kashmiri pundits, which seems to me to speak of the composition of social classes and publics in Kashmir in Sheikh Abdullah's early life. That elite Muslims and poor pundits overlap in that kind of Venn diagram of Kashmiri society of the period, whereas more common poor Muslims and middle to upper class pundits may not have actually come together, but Abdullah, this was what came together. You even address how Sheikh Abdullah, when he was first called the Lion of Kashmir, was chosen to become leader because he was he was uniquely in that group from a poor Muslim background, such that making him the leader might make their movement more appealing to the masses. So do you think these kind of religious-based policies of the Dogras that produced maybe religiously linked socioeconomic demographics was a significant component in Sheikh Abdullah's life and political career? Okay, finally, regarding Kashmiriyat, in 2023, I contributed a chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Critical Kashmir Studies titled Religious and Political Power in Kashmir, Recollecting the Past for the Post-Colonial Present, which is in fact built on the presentation I gave at the event that you organized a number of years ago at William and Mary to mark the publication of your edited volume, Kashmiri History, Politics, and Representation. In that chapter, I argue that at one point that discourses around Kashmiriyat, that Kashmiriyat would be considered Kashmir's true heritage and culture, can serve to shift the debate over Kashmir's political belonging away from the will of Kashmiri people to questions of Kashmir kind of essence in the past. A conversation that then is primarily engaged, debated, and kind of controlled in elite circles by scholars and others in the halls of those most privileged. So at times, even some advocates of Kashmiriyat have implied that if the expressed will of the Kashmiri people opposes that which is articulated in their notion of Kashmiriyat, then Kashmiriyat should guide political policies over Kashmir against that which, quote, violates the syncretic ethos of Kashmir. It's almost as if expressing political opinions that are not in line with this syncretic ethos of Kashmir puts into question one's being considered truly Kashmiri, and thus whether one's opinions should be included in conversations deciding Kashmir's political belonging and whatnot. So in this dynamic, you see kind of, in effect, conversations around Kashmir and the question of Kashmir's belonging. Do you think Sheikh Abdullah was aware of this kind of dynamic, that shifting the conversation from a kind of plebiscite, what do the people want, put it up for a vote, to questions about Kashmiriyat and what is Kashmiri culture and heritage, might shift who is in control of the conversation and the decisions around Kashmiri belonging? And how might you, or maybe Sheikh Abdullah, if you can kind of channel him from all of your research, how might they address this dynamic, both in regard to the political contestation over Kashmir, as well as how we discuss Abdullah's advocacy for Kashmir during his political life, if it in fact does this type of shift?
Can I understand, from my understanding, I'm sure she understood what you asked.
I have no clue.
The third question.
I
The third
Can
question.
you just say it without
Yeah,
reading
yeah.
this out and tell us
Yeah,
what you want
the third question is that the idea of Kashmiriyat, when it enters politics, generates a certain kind of elite dynamics, or there are certain kinds of elites who get privileged if it's emphasized as political discourse, and certain kinds of elites would get underprivileged. I mean, is that the point?
Yeah.
Say a bit more about this. It's a very interesting point. I want to understand what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So if the idea is we should be making decisions about the kind of the political destiny, belonging, or even nitty-gritty politics of Kashmir, that should it be upon a kind of on a democratic basis on what the people want and are choosing, or should it be on the basis of we need to be true to the kind of essence of Kashmir? We need to be true to our Kashmiri heritage, and so our policies should follow suit. That is, and that when you do that, it often then shifts the conversation from, oh, we should, have a vote or a referendum or something like that, to, well, we need to have researchers who can tell us what the heritage and culture of Kashmir is so that we can be true to it. And that shifts who is in charge of the conversation.
So a democratic form of politics may not necessarily, you're saying, logically, necessarily express Kashmiriyat, it might express something else.
Yes, it might.
And you might want to try to bring Kashmiriyat into it, but it does not necessarily happen. Democratic form of politics in Kashmir can take a form which is Kashmiriyat plus, or could be anti-Kashmir. Anti-Kashmiriyat will be hard to imagine, but Kashmiriyat plus, or significantly pluralized Kashmiriyat, or significantly diluted Kashmiriyat, is that the point?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways you can kind of frame it in a, in a different circumstance of saying, how many times Nehru went around talking about like, what is the heritage of India, and we need to be true to our Indian heritage, this sort of thing, that then you could say, okay, so based upon his writing about the history of India, that we need to continue this tradition and continue our progress towards whatever, or somebody else could say, well, you need to just ask the population what they want, as far as land reforms or secularism or all these different things, that those might go in different directions.
Is your worry that emphasizing Kashmiriyat would not only privilege scholars trying to figure out what is their senses, what is his heritage, etc., but also would run up against the idea that Jammu will not buy into Kashmir?
I wasn't necessarily bringing in the Jammu side, but it's an important point to bring in. But I think
when I worked on this material, I mean, the Jammu was trending out again and again. This is nearly half of the state. How is it going to be accommodated in a Kashmiri imagination of politics? How is it going to accommodate? It's 46% of J&K.
But Kashmiriyat does not include Jammu.
Does not include Jammu. That's why I asked the last question. Okay. Anyway.
Yeah. So I think it's for me at least,
yeah.
it's a question of, as you kind of mentioned before, a kind of debate between democracy and being true to some vision of your people or something like that.
But Kashmiriyat has been kind of it's déclassé now in Kashmir. I mean, that's not no longer something that. And Sheikh Abdullah, National Conference was the one that really came up with this idea, right, to align it with Indian nationalism and so on. And he himself, once he made the accord, he basically turned completely. Actually, after 1953, he completely turned against that idea himself, right? So
let me suggest one thing. Let's have Suvaid also comment, and I'm making notes of the questions. You may forget, but I won't forget.
No, I think I should respond first,
Okay.
because otherwise it'll be
Okay,
too much going on.
Okay.
And,
All right. So the three questions here.
Yeah. So the first is why Indian lives, and I did sort of think that this would be a problem with left-leaning scholars, right? I mean, they always pick on me for this, that you are always within the Indian nation-state framework, and I'm done with it. I've moved on from it, because he is even though Sheikh Abdullah himself never said that he was Indian, right? I mean, he in his passport application he wrote that he was Kashmiri Muslim, right? So there's this kind of interesting thing. But again, for all intents and purposes, he was a politician in independent India and in colonial India, colonial united India and then post-colonial India. I mean, he always tried to kind of form a bridge between India and Pakistan, but he did it from the Indian side and from the Indian perspective. So he always thought of Pakistan as sort of the other. I mean, he was completely against, by the way, Jinnah and Pakistan in the colonial period. After 1953, he of course became dear friends with Pakistan, and then revisioned the whole thing and felt that Pakistan now exists, and so I have to kind of bridge this divide and so on. And I think that was part of his way of leverage, right? I mean, but he had this big leverage against India. I mean, he could say that, I mean, I can go to them, right? I mean, and so so for all intents and purposes, the man, it's an Indian life. Right? So I mean, if you want to quibble with me about it, fine, go ahead. That's
It might be an ambivalent Indian life, but it's an Indian life.
But who wasn't ambivalent, right? I mean, there are lots and lots. I mean, it's not just
Tamil politicians were ambivalent and they might become ambivalent again if given the way Indian politics are going.
But lots. What does it mean to be Indian itself, right? And I think that these biographies are trying to do that in part, right? I mean, to really kind of make us revision the idea of India, right? And at one time, Indian nationalism was capacious enough to include Kashmir, right? And Sheikh Abdullah knew that and was happy with it, right? I mean, so yes, the Indian state has carried out all sorts of, and India is responsible, blah blah, which I point out, but it's kind of, that's neither here nor there. It doesn't help us to understand anything better, to say it's not an Indian life, it's a Pakistani life, it's a Kashmiri life, I mean, whatever. You want to call it that, call it, I don't care, but it doesn't change the book much.
Can I just add one point to this? When I was reading the declassified dispatches of the American ambassador or deputy ambassador Lloyd Henderson, the name that is ringing in my mind.
Lloyd Henderson.
And so the State Department just declassified those documents. So my assistants pointed me to that. Just look at this very important paragraph. I was looking for it. I can't find it. But I remember the essence of it. This is a dispatch from Lloyd Henderson to Secretary of State in Washington. It says Sheikh Abdullah came to see me, and I asked him, "What would you ideally want?" He said, "I want Kashmiri independence." If Kashmiri independence is not available, what would you want? We want Pakistan or India? He said, "Never Pakistan." Is what what you used to be called telegram, I think. This was a telegram. Never Pakistan. If Kashmiri independence is not possible, then in India. But never Pakistan. I remember the term in that telegram. Never Pakistan.
But because he would be nobody in Pakistan, he had burned all bridges.
And then his speeches to the Security Council that I read, they make it very clear he's completely opposed to Jinnah. This is 1950, I think. Whatever happened after 53. Completely, implacably opposed to Jinnah. Anyway, what I'm saying is I'm trying to, I'm speaking too much a seminar chair here, but I should keep quiet. But it's just such an interesting question you ask. The idea that people can be ambivalent about India, right? Tamil politicians were. That didn't make them un-Indian. They were trying to figure out how to be Tamil and Indian, sometimes more Tamil, sometimes less, right? Etc. And so there was this internal tension in the relationship without being completely resolved in favor of one or the other. Somehow, let's match the two. Somehow, let's bring them together.
Well, Sheikh Abdullah, there was two things, right? So it was not just the fact that he was Kashmiri, but also that he was Muslim, right? So I mean, these two things, and he was adamant throughout his life that I can be loyal to India. He didn't say I can be Indian. He said I can be loyal to India and still be these two things, So I mean, you can. What was the second question?
History versus.
So what kind of life? In Kashmir's contested past, I talk about how hagiography is in fact a form of history. So the life narratives of these saints. Not that I'm saying that this is hagiography, but so I think these genres blend into each other. So at times it's probably a biography. At times it's I guess it's a hagiography if you say so. Without the negative connotations attached to that term, obviously, and then at times it's clearly sort of social political history through this kind of figure. So, but I think one of the points that I make in my second book is in fact that the line between these genres is much more fluid than has been made out to be. And so poetry was basically history, right? I mean, in ancient India. And the third question about Kashmirian, I still don't quite understand what you're asking me in terms of Sheikh Abdullah, but I think I answered it that Sheikh Abdullah was a proponent of Kashmiriyat, and because for him Kashmiriyat was this vision of plurality and pluralism in Kashmir, right? And he deployed it to bring Kashmir into the larger narrative of Indian nationalism when it suited him, and then, of course, became its critic right after 1953 when he felt that India was not living up to its promises and so on. I don't know if that's what you.
And what was between 77 and 83?
Well, then he was completely against it, right? So he gets elected on an anti-India pro-autonomy platform, right? So he's constantly quibbling with the center. Then it's more, it's less about sort of, this narrative of Kashmiriyat and more about, what's the relationship, what should be the relationship between center and states. Right? Then it's much more about, why do we, so he did this interview with India Today or whatever, in which he said, we have to before we sneeze, we have to ask the center now, because this is a moment of centralization under Mrs. Gandhi. Exactly. So yeah, that's, at that time, it's, that's what becomes.
But let me ask you, both of you.
Sure.
You will, yes. Suvaid. Yes.
Yeah.
Suvaid Yaseen is, before we get to engage in this conversation, I'm sure Suvaid will put some more points here. Suvaid took his PhD from Brown's History Department last year and received the very prestigious Joukowsky Family Prize for writing an outstanding dissertation. Taught at Smith and has been teaching here. And he's a scholar of history, a scholar of Kashmiri history.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks Ashu first of all for organizing this event and inviting Chitralekha to discuss this work. Thank you for making the journey and sharing your text early and sharing your thoughts with us today. Dean has already made my job somewhat easier or difficult, I'm not sure what, but he already highlighted some significant points, so hopefully I won't be repeating of what he has already mentioned. In my brief remarks, I'll keep it brief, I have three interrelated questions to ask vis-a-vis this particular work. The first is about historiographical choices and conceptual framings. The second concerns the examination of lives of various historical actors in the present, especially someone like Sheikh Abdullah, whose legacies, as you write, remain bitterly contested. And third is an inquiry and an invitation. You talked about it a little bit, but maybe to expand more on the choice and the consequence of employing academic biography as a form of history. And as a segue into my first question, I want to note that this is the second Kashmir book talk we had this semester at Brown. In early March, some of the audience attended as well. We hosted Hafsa Kanjwal at the History Department to discuss her book, Colonizing Kashmir, State Building Under Indian Occupation, published by Stanford last year. And as you know, and you have cited Kanjwal's dissertation in your book, Colonizing Kashmir examines a range of Indian state-building practices during the tenure of Ghulam Muhammad Bakshi, the second Prime Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, for a decade after Sheikh Abdullah's arrest and forcible removal in 1953. To put very briefly, Kanjwal's work examines the successes and failures of a range of hegemonic practices related to the politics of life. It's a term she derives from Neil Gordon's work on Israel's occupation of Palestine, as well as coercive tactics and outright state repression against dissenting political groups in Kashmir in the 1950s, 1960s, and beyond. Many of these are noted in your book as well. And during her talk, Kanjwal, among other things, mentioned her reason for choosing a figure such as Bakshi as the subject of her study, and here for the sake of brevity and clarity. Let me quote from an interview I did with her some time ago. Kanjwal says, quote, "I chose Bakshi precisely because I found that there was so little written about him or the decade that he was in power, even though it appeared to me from preliminary research that this was the time that so much of the financial, cultural, legal, and political contours of India's colonial occupation were entrenched," end quote. And Chitralekha, in your book, you write in the introduction how this biography, quote, "addresses a gaping lacuna in the scholarship on late colonial India, which shies away from biographies in general, other than of figures such as Nehru, Gandhi, Subhash Bose, and more recently, B.R. Ambedkar, with little regard for regional leaders such as Abdullah, who played an outsized role in influencing the course of inter-region relations in the subcontinent," end quote. Both quotes correctly point towards the historiographical absence of otherwise key figures in modern political history of Kashmir. Although it must be noted that while a systematic examination of a figure such as Bakshi was entirely absent previously, Sheikh Abdullah has been written about a lot more, including as subject of works dedicated entirely to him, as you mentioned in your book too, or invariably in relation to histories of major Kashmiri political groups he was associated with, or in the histories that detail Kashmir-India relations over many decades. Yet, both these quotations also show major differences in framing. Kanjwal examines Bakshi's role as a client politician who at times is seen pursuing the rights of Kashmiri Muslims, and at other times as a toothless technocratic collaborator who entrenched Indian state's control of Kashmir. Ironically, this happens at a time when India under Nehru was among the leading voices of global decolonization and non-aligned movement. You talked about potential and so on. And it's precisely during this period, as your book shows, that Abdullah was forcefully articulating serious doubts about his decisions. And we must take them seriously as well. Accession to India, political friendships with Indian National Congress leaders, future of Kashmir with India, and so on. And in fact, pays the price for doing so through a coup, multiple incarcerations, and I'm thankful that you calculated the exact number of days. I was always wondering about that. And eventually the loss of his power and legitimacy in Kashmir. But in contrast to Kanjwal's framing of the story of one as a collaborating client politician under colonial rule, you examine Abdullah as a quote regional leader playing his outsized part in the course of center-region relations. I wonder how you might respond to such divergent framings. Are we taking for granted the location of a center and periphery of what constitutes a location of national in this case, if you could talk about a little more? I ask this especially in the context of recent scholarship on Kashmir, which has not only contested such old descriptions, but also forcefully critiqued the normative underpinnings and the politics of a host of other terms routinely used by academics while writing about Kashmir: alienation, separatism, secessionism, Iranianism, better relations, Kashmiri, and so on. In fact, a range of scholars across disciplines of history, anthropology, religion, political science, law, media studies, so on, increasingly argue for the use of alternative terms and concepts: colonialism, occupation, occupational constitutionalism, militarized governance, more recently settler colonialism, 2019. You refer to those incidents as well. The overall argument, obviously, being that terms such as region-state relations obfuscate the massive asymmetry between the Indian state, its client regimes, and Kashmiri people struggling for self-determination. And any critical historical account must reflect such realities of coercive power and the state of permanent emergency and permanent exception that the Indian control of Kashmir entails. In other words, the terms of conversation have changed, and it remains important not to cede critical conceptual ground, even as politically we might seem to be going in the opposite direction. My second point is about examining lives of figures whose legacies are bitterly contested in the present. As your book deftly shows, how Abdullah's politics was not only challenged by a range of actors in his own time, but also continues to be contested in the present, in and outside Kashmir. I'm a little bit more concerned about his image in Kashmir. Your book opens with an evocative description of the sense of mourning, you call it Ashura, in Kashmir on the occasion of Abdullah's death in 1982. You write about the day after, so to say. I'll quote, the beloved Sher Kashmir, Lion of Kashmir, Baba-i-Qaum, Father of Nation, the symbol of their emancipation, had passed away the day before and was on his last journey to Hazratbal. There he was buried at a serene spot on the banks of Nagin Lake on 9 September 1982. In death as in life, he seemed caught between India and Kashmir, his body wrapped in the Indian flag and carried by and lowered into its final resting place by Indian Army soldiers. Today, his gravesite, surrounded by spools of concertina wire, is guarded by soldiers from the same army to protect it from defilement by Kashmiri people, end quote. The past and present sentiments are perfectly captured in this opening passage, although I should mention a minor point here that Abdullah's gravesite is not on the banks of Nagin Lake as written in the book. I read the PDF. It's on the banks of Dal Lake next to Kashmir University. Nagin Lake is a few miles down the road. In any case, my question is about historical legacy and thinking about contentious actors. Is present a distraction for a historian? I ask this because in your previous work on Kashmir's contested past, you contrasted the narrative public of the late 19th and early 20th century with what you call the fractured or divided public sphere of the then present, which you were critical of. That book came out in 2014, when people could still write and express opinions in local newspapers, for example, albeit with constraints. Since then, even the fractured public sphere is all but gone, especially since 2019, as noted by many scholars of the region. Any real journalism or any kind of critical writing in Kashmir has become extremely difficult and comes with a range of consequences. In this context, and as Dean sort of referred to this, you note how books about Abdullah were written and published during crucial instances in Pakistan and India on the eve of elections during the peak of the armed struggle in the 1990s, and so on, to shore up his legitimacy. And I understand you started working on this biography a while ago, you mentioned 2014. So again, what kind of intervention do you think the book makes in the current scenario, or how it might be received at a time when even the leftovers of autonomy that Abdullah negotiated with India in 1949 sounds like a distant memory? Perhaps it would be no exaggeration to note that Naya Kashmir of the 1940s has returned, the BJP government uses this all the time, has returned as a great farce since in the last few years. My final question, it's very short, is about academic biography as a form of history. You write, quote, "This biography accordingly probes the ways in which Abdullah's life, along with the lives of many other individuals who surrounded him, interacted with, was influenced by, and in turn shaped by historical events, processes, and ideologies in the 20th century." End quote. I'm curious to know about the methodological aspects of selecting the cast of people that Abdullah was in conversation with, and how you came to decide who gets how much ink, so to speak. Early on in the book, you have very helpful description, short bios of many characters who then come up time and again during the course of the book, and it's really helpful to follow. My question is that while of course Abdullah is shaped by people around him, who are his friends and comrades, but arguably he's shaped more through a dialectic with those who opposed him, or his legacy more consistently in Kashmir, such as Mirwais Yusuf Shah, Chaudhry Abbas, Muslim, MUF, Jamaat Islami, so on. And these range of characters seem to get only generic mentions in this story without affording them much nuance, whether on account of their politics, religious inclinations, or their own social class, or that of their followers.
I disagree. I talked about Abbas and Mirwais in great length. So,
One part.
Yeah, finish it, okay.
I'm curious if this is so for the lack of space. Okay, we disagree. Compulsions of biographical form, which can only accomplish so much. I'm asking this because of the fact, mentioned also in the book itself, that Abdullah's story does and can pass for the broader history of the making of modern Kashmir. And given the book's editor's framing of it as a quintessential Indian story, which one must add is arguably more legible on account of Abdullah's ideological association with secularism, progress, commitment to Indian nation, loyal, or so on, can only reinforce the centering of the narrative of the Indian nation, Indian ideology, so to say, which eventually was the master that caged the lion. That's something in the title. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. So I'm trying to remember now. The first I'm stuck with the last bit and I've forgotten the first. What was
So the framing.
yeah.
Why do you choose? Why not colonialism, colonial occupation, permanent
yeah.
emergency, settler colonialism, as opposed to something else? As opposed to center and periphery, region, center state,
all of my works have been militating against the idea of Kashmir as exceptional. And I don't think Kashmir was or is exceptional in the way that it's been dealt with in India. I think came out the outcome after 2019 and so on is clearly goes much further, and in part it is of course because of the fact that it's dispute, still considered sort of this disputed territory, and 2019 was the BJP's way of saying basically the dispute is over, this part is ours, that part is yours, we are done with this whole thing, and then of course they went a step further and took away the statehood, that's an issue, but I have always felt that the only way that you can really understand Kashmir is in the context of other places that same things were happening in the northeast and even with the south. And has to be seen in the context of center-state relations. That's just my opinion as a scholar. I don't think that critical Kashmir studies really adds anything to understanding. I'm sorry. No, I'm just saying that's where Hafsa Kanjwal and so on they come from that perspective. And what it does is that it really basically in the Indian context people just ignore it, and they call that scholarship basically, pro-Kashmir, pro-Kashmiri self-determination.
But that's also curious why people would ignore what they call a pro-Kashmir scholarship. It's also about who is speaking for the narrative, right?
Right. So, I have no idea how this book will be. But your next question was how is it going to be received in Kashmir? I have no idea where it fits.
Especially
today.
after 2019,
Yeah, where
August
it
5,
fits today,
2019.
and I'm not exactly sure of it because I haven't been back to Kashmir since 2018 for a variety of reasons. I didn't 2019 I didn't go back, and then 2020 the pandemic, and then just things kept happening, and my personal life took a turn, and I couldn't. But I am planning on going in the summer, and you really need to be there to be able to get a sense of what this means. Not just this book, but what's happening. It seems to me that Kashmir is kind of in a state of suspended animation or limbo. It's some kind of something in between two places. I really I don't know what where this.
But would you agree at all with the term Indian occupation of Kashmir or settler colonialism? We have discussed that with respect to many parts of the world. Is this concept of Indian occupation of Kashmir or settler colonialism in Kashmir after 2019 or whatever, certainly would have been, even before. Would you agree? Would you agree with this, with the application of a concept of that sort to understand Kashmir?
Yeah, I suppose. I suppose you could apply it to understand, India's role in Kashmir. But again,
Political science won't. But anyway, that's a separate issue. We are not discussing political science. We are discussing a historian's understanding of. So you wouldn't mind the use of the term settler colonialism?
I mean, and I think I use it, occasionally, some places. But that, my understand, as a historian, I think that it's much more complicated than that, right? And again, this it makes me sound like the president of Harvard who got fired for saying that it's more complicated or something, right? But what I think I'm trying to. So what I'm trying to say is that you need to look at the role played by several actors, including, by the way, Sheikh Abdullah. So Sheikh Abdullah, I think, his regime between 1948 and 1953 really set the tone for what happens later with Bakshi, for instance, right? I mean, he is the one who sets the tone for this relationship between Kashmir and India, which Bakshi then basically carries forward because Abdullah in 1953, for a variety of reasons, does a volte-face on that and suddenly starts demanding autonomy, right? And so on. So there's there is it's more complicated than sort of saying and of course Kashmir for the Indian state is the cause of most anxiety, right? I mean, it's disputed with Pakistan, it's Muslim majority, it's meant to, at least at that time, stand in for Indian secularism, and as I said at the beginning, Abdullah sort of embodies this, embodies the problem, right? Because he represents the Kashmiri nation, whatever you say about him, right? And this is why I think he's more important than Bakshi in some ways, because he still represents the Kashmiri identity. Even though you might hate him, he still is that essence of the Kashmiri nation in some ways, right?
Bakshi didn't go to jail.
And
maybe very little Kashmir.
Right.
Abdullah was in jail for 16 years.
And Bakshi, by the way,
Look, essence is also a curious word, no? Why Abdullah essence?
But
sometimes people also get historiographically created.
Right.
Debate that is
Yeah.
Gandhi the essence of India, or is it something else?
So true, but that's what so what does it mean for Sheikh Abdullah to be, the symbol of this identity? And I think this book is trying to get at that. Why is this figure so important, right? Not just to Kashmir, but to India, right? Because even though India might, sort of pretend like it doesn't exist now, the fact is that the first thing BJP did when they, when they, abrogated 370 and took away statehood.
Put the unionists into jail because everybody else was already in jail.
No, not just that. They, got rid of Sheikh Abdullah from, police medals. They got rid of his birthday as a national holiday. So why are you going after this person?
The 77 deal was constructed by late 75 deal is under Mrs. Gandhi an emergency, and
It was before the emergency.
It was struck before the emergency. It was before the emergency. Sorry.
Yeah, it's before the
Audience questions.
Sure. Let's go around. We still have 15 minutes left. Roughly 15 minutes left. Let's obviously get out. This is very interesting. What's gone on here? Certainly very, very interesting. But yes, any questions from the audience? Yes. Tirana.
Thank you so much. So I was wondering, as you were saying, that Kashmir isn't really that exceptional at this point in time. And I
Not
suppose
just at this point in time. I think Kashmir is historically not accepted.
Right, fair. So one could say that I suppose like post-45 or even pre-45, there are lots of places where that states of exception are not exceptional at all, right? That conditions of emergency or exception exist within the post-colonial Indian state, but also elsewhere in the decolonized world. So on that point, I was wondering how Sheikh Abdullah, perhaps prior to 45 or even prior to 39, thinks about other regions and provinces within South Asia, to what extent in his own autobiography or other writings or speeches is he reflecting on places like Tamil Nadu or Tamil-speaking areas in the Northeast. You mentioned his commitment to the idea of a federal India, with a sort of perhaps a center that isn't necessarily that strong. So is Sheikh Abdullah thinking explicitly about these contexts and maybe even making links with other princely states or even areas that are still within the remit of British India, and even maybe perhaps places outside of British India? Like, what's his sense of the world at large? It seems like he's obviously thinking about the Soviet Union as a space where they can sort of create a state building, right, and new sort of constitutional ways of being. So I'm curious about how, even before the politics of the Second World War and decolonization begins in the 40s, he's thinking through all these issues, who his interlocutors are, what kinds of things is he reading, and in which languages.
Yeah, one of the things about Sheikh Abdullah was he wasn't particularly sort of well-read, and which is why he sort of attached himself to personalities like Nehru or, the communists of various kinds, because he always had this sense of, he had a very vernacular education, which doesn't necessarily mean that he would not be well-read, but what it means is he was in the sciences, right? So he went to study science in Islamicate College and he had an MSc in chemistry, so he wasn't sort of...
Did he go to AMU? No.
Yes.
AMU, MSc in chemistry from AMU.
He wasn't a particularly good, student. So he always felt that there was this kind of lack in his understanding of the world at large, and that these people, and this was a question that Suvaid asked, why did you choose certain people? It's the people who really influenced him that I have, included in this biography, who kind of provided him with that ideological kind of scaffolding that, helped him kind of present himself as this leader. So, for instance, Premnath Bazaz, who was a Kashmiri Pandit, wrote a biography of him in 1930, that was published in 1934, called KashmirConnected, which kind of places him in that kind of nationalist, anti-colonial nationalist of the Congress, framework, right? And he took to that, hook, line, and sinker. I mean, that I'm for secular pluralism and this, that, and the other. And then in the 1940s, he really turns towards the communists. The Communist Party of India is very active, and the communists provide him with this framework for thinking about Kashmir in these sort of, equality, social and economic equality in particular that cuts across class and sectarian lines, which again aligns with this earlier vision of pluralism that he also had. So, that's where he draws his sort of larger ideologies from, and it's surprising. And this is something that I've thought about as well, and I was looking for it in the sources. I mean, is he talking or at least has some connection with or thinking in terms of other regions, right? and I mean the Northeast in particular, for instance, or the South, and so on, and nothing, it doesn't really come out in his in part. And this is what I mean when I say that it's difficult. It was difficult for me because he didn't really write very much, and his autobiography is not particularly thoughtful or self-reflexive, and so on, right? I mean, it's just kind of a political screed, basically. I mean, there are some interesting parts to it, but so it's difficult to. There are some moments where you see it sort of coming out. So, for instance, in 1971, when the Bangladesh sort of conflict and war started, he was totally for the Pakistani state. So he gave several interviews saying that I understand that these Pakistanis are fighting for their freedom and self-determination and so on, but Pakistan has a right to exist, and if it needs to make war on them, then that's what it has to be like. And everyone called him out and said, but it wasn't just, he wasn't being they called him a hypocrite. He wasn't just being a hypocrite. He was sort of supporting what he felt was needed to be supported, which was Pakistan, the state, which was, because that was important for him as leverage. And in fact, after 1971, he basically made a deal with India because Pakistan had been, cut to size and so on. So, in those kinds of moments, so in the 1977 elections, when everyone had turned against him and joined the Janata Party, and they were running against him. That's when he made an overture to the Janata Party leadership, and he said, "Why can't you form an alliance with the national Janata leadership, not the Kashmiri Janata leadership? Why can't you form an alliance with the national one? You can form alliances with the northeastern, groups, because the Janata Party had formed alliances with the Nagas and so on. You can form with them, but you can't form with us. So those kinds of moments that this kind of understanding of other regions comes through.
Does he ever talk about Indian Islam in general?
Yeah,
And does quite a bit, not
quite a bit, but he does. Yeah, he does. So he was asked once in 1968, 4 or 8, one of those times, by an interviewer, what do you think about Indian Muslims, and how do you see yourself positioned, in that sort of arena? And he said, yes, Indian Muslims are very disunited, and they need to unite, and they need to understand. And again, he went off on this secular thing of, India secular. He kept saying that even in the 1970s, even 60s and 70s, that India cannot exist without its secularism. But of course, again, what does that mean, and so on. We can, go on about. But then he said, my remit right now is to resolve this Kashmir issue, right? And once that is done, then maybe I can think about, where Indian Muslims move to this. So yeah, that's.
But Northeast perhaps never, right?
Once,
One sentence on that.
Yeah.
Kerala Islam ever?
No.
Never. Kerala Islam never.
Even though he was in the south, like he was.
Kodaikanal.
Yeah, he was, exiled for a few years in Kodaikanal. Yeah.
But never talked about Southern Islam and how it's different from Northern Islam. No, never. Other questions? Yeah.
Well, you made a very brief mention about, in maybe it was the post-1947 Nehru papers, that Nehru kind of thinking about relationships with the Soviet Union and America, and understanding his relationship to Sheikh Abdullah in the context of those kind of transnational ideas. Would love to hear you expand a bit more on that.
Nehru was, very, had this kind of, I won't say antipathy, but he was obviously had an issue with America. He was very, very upset and angry about the way that the Anglo-American bloc was dealing with the Indian
Argument in the UN.
Exactly, for Kashmir, and how they basically closed ranks and stood for Pakistan, and that made him, I think, want to support Sheikh Abdullah even more as somebody who could kind of he stuck by him and said, I don't care what the world thinks, I'm going to stick by this man who he kept saying represents all Kashmiris, all of the state, and is going to kind of deliver Kashmir to India in the event of a plebiscite, and so on. So those kinds of and then also once the Anglo-American bloc started talking about so once Sheikh Abdullah started talking about independence, this really kind of it bothered Nehru, because he said, I have been presenting him to the world as being pro-India, and now he's going around talking about independence. How am I going to kind of square this with what's going on? He also, once he was removed, so Nehru knew about the fact that Sheikh Abdullah was going to be deposed. He was for it because he had reached the end of his tether with him by August of 1953, but he was not for his arrest. Right? And then he was completely against, once he was removed and arrested, of them maligning him as being sort of a pro-Pakistani agent, because that's what Bakshi did. Right? I mean, they said he's pro-Pakistani, he's pro-American, all sorts of things. And he said, for Nehru, this was, I have been calling him, we have been sort of painting him as being pro-India, and now suddenly we're turning around and saying he's pro-Pakistan. We're going to look like fools, right? So you have to stop, he was completely against tearing him down and so on. But again, Nehru really wanted him released. Like, there's so many letters I found in this post-1947 papers in which Nehru's writing to Bakshi saying, I do not agree with what you have done with this. You need to release the man. You arrested him in the cover of night. This is not the way democracy is supposed to function. Release him, release him. But then there is this entire apparatus, in place, right? I mean, it's not, Nehru has no, control over any of this. I mean, his intelligence bureau, his home ministry and so on, they're completely against Sheikh Abdullah and want to, because Bakshi has proven himself to be a reliable agent, of the Indian state. So they want to keep him in place and they don't want Abdullah. So they,
I also read in Gopal's biography on this question that he just posed. Gopal is mentioning again and again in Nehru's biography that he's writing to Bakshi Ghulam and asking, why can't you bring him to court? Apparently, the arrest was never judicially approved.
Of course not.
He was never brought to the court. Huh?
He was only charged in the conspiracy in the 1950, like 1958.
Yeah.
Right? So until then, there was from 53 to
58, he is in jail somewhere, wherever he is, and is never been brought to the court. Never, and the arrest was never judicially approved. So that Gopal mentions that. Gopal, as a historian and a biographer, mentions that, in some detail in that chapter on Kashmir. There are several chapters on Kashmir, of course, in the three volumes. And so you also find no.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So something I think both of us were interested in reading your book is that, and you can disagree with me if you want, but that I feel like a conceit of history is that we know people are reading histories often to answer or address social and political questions in the present. That people are like, oh, I read about George Washington, therefore this is what we got to do in America today, or something like that, right? So, knowing that this is often how history is read in order to somehow say something about the present, what kind of impact do you want this book to have on your audience? Who's your intended audience, and what impact would you like that?
I want this book to be as widely read as possible so that I can make actual money out of it.
The royalty is good.
I have no idea. I mean, it just came out, right? So no idea.
Yeah, she won't know until next month.
Next year.
Next month. That's when she'll get a note from both Yale and Harvard.
But it has been on the bestseller list in India since it came out. So I didn't know what that meant, but HarperCollins sent me this list, and I'm like, what is this showing me? So that was something I had a drink that day. So.
What do you want?
I want people in the subcontinent to be able to kind of understand Kashmir from the perspective of this person and how India came into existence, both the good and the bad of it. I think that all of the books that I've written so far are mostly inaccessible to regular folk. But this could be one of those accessible books that allows them to kind of understand, Kashmir and India through the prism of this one individual whom they've kind of sort of heard of, but don't really know, who he was. So, and from what I've been seeing, I mean, this is just kind of. A little bit of a sense that I'm getting. It's just regular people who are reading it and write to me, saying that we don't agree with you, what you're saying, but we enjoyed reading it and we learned something from it. So that's all I can, hope for. So, I mean, it's not going to make the BJP change their mind, obviously, about what they've done. But if it enhances their understanding of it, maybe who knows, So, and by the way, BJP is not responsible for what happened in 2019. Let's be very clear about this. Right? I mean, it's easy to pin them down and blame them for it. I mean, this is a very long process of dismantling, right? I mean, Anuradha Wasim's dismantled state, basically.
You mean dismantling of 370? It's gone on for so long.
Yeah, but 370 is just a dismantling of the state of Kashmir, right? I mean, I'm not talking about 370 is just whatever symbol of, everyone is like beating their drums about 370. But it's about the institutions of Kashmir are demolished, right, by the Congress in concert with, by the way, people like him and Bakshi. He was the one who started it and then ended it in his regime from 1975 to 82. Despite all of his thing about pro-autonomy and all this. So there's no institutions in Kashmir, right? So that's what they've done. So Article 370, I think it just enlarged the end of that. Yes.
Well, 4 o'clock, this brings us to an end. Those of you here, our last meetings are next week. There are 2 lectures by Tulkoli on BJP. I hope you'll come. This is the first time he's publicly speaking, and of course, based on his book, new book. But it's time now to thank Chitralekha, Dean, and Suvaid for giving us so much food for thought. Thank you very much.